a strong shift of younger people in America away from supporting Israel. And so, that certainly would logically explain why somebody like Kirk would sort of shift in the same direction. And that's really all I knew about Kirk. In other words, I probably watched more videos of Kirk's statements in the last couple of months than I had in the previous several years combined. And then suddenly, Kirk is assassinated. And so, that raised initial suspicions in my mind. And not only that, but I mean, Kirk was killed on September 10th, one day before the September 11th anniversary. Not only that, but I'm sure you may have heard, I just found out a few days ago that Tucker Carlson had been about to release a new documentary series on the September 11th attacks. And apparently it was going to be a very controversial series. I'd seen him on the Piers Morgan show. I watched the show. In fact, I'd been planning to write an article for this Monday's release on September 11th anniversary and on Tucker Carlson's video documentary. But Carlson ended up delaying his documentary because of, the Kirk killing. And so, it just seemed to me that, if somebody as prominent apparently as Kirk is assassinated one day before the September 11th anniversary, that means suddenly there's no attention given to that anniversary. It sweeps everything else away. So I really became very suspicious that, maybe the Israelis had been involved in Kirk's assassination, because the whole thing about it is, look at, for example, someone like Candace Owens. Candace Owens had come from exactly that same background. I think she may have worked for Kirk's organization at some point, and then she worked for example, Ben Shapiro's organization.
She was at Prager University before she went to Daily Wire.
She was a young conservative activist of exactly that same type. And yet in the last several years, she'd suddenly shifted her ground dramatically and become very hostile, very concerned about Israeli power, about Mossad. She declared that Mossad had been involved. Apparently, the Israelis had probably been involved in the September 11th attacks. And, that caused, her to receive a huge audience. For example, I think it was about 5 or 6 months ago, the Israelis had attacked the USS Liberty in 1967 and, killed or wounded 200 American servicemen. It was the worst naval attack America had suffered since the Second World War. And it was completely covered up by the American government. And so Candace Owens actually had one of the main Liberty survivors on her show. And she probably got more attention for the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty than had been gotten by all the other events and documentaries in the 50 or 60 years since that attack, because she's a high-profile media figure. So, it seemed to me that if it seemed that someone like Charlie Kirk, who, is a much more prominent figure than Candace Owens had been when she was a conservative, if he seemed to be shifting in the same direction, moving in the same direction as Candace Owens had moved, that would cause tremendous concern in certain quarters, because, Kirk had such a strong following among young Americans. And, I mean, the fact that basically Tucker Carlson had given that speech at his organization, I mean, we're talking about something that could have a huge ideological impact on American society. So, I mean, that was, my original suspicion. And, it could be that they found it was just a transgender activist. But, one thing that also made me suspicious is when the shooter got away, but it left behind clear evidence that he was an anti-Fa activist or transgender activist. I mean, that seemed very reminiscent of, when the planes hit the World Trade Center. There was a huge fireball, and allegedly they generated such a gigantic explosion they knocked down the World Trade Center, those two World Trade Center buildings, and even caused Building 7 to collapse. Yet one of the passports of a hijacker allegedly was thrown free of the explosions on the planes, so that it fell to the ground and was picked up by an ordinary, public spirited citizen. So, I mean, that's just a ridiculous story that, I mean, is one of the key things about September 11th that, is absurd. And